It's Sunday, December 29, 2024. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to The Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News. Our guest today is a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter, author of 7 books, including The Making of Donald Trump and most recently The Big Cheat, How Donald Trump Fleeced America and Enriched Himself and His Family. David Cay Johnston, welcome to The Weekend Show.
Glad to be here.
David, we are in a unique time in American political history, and I, for one, as an immigrant who moved to the U.S. to the free world, as my ancestors did, probably didn't expect the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of fascism, and potentially the kind of reconstruction of the world order. I mean, that seems like that's the way it's potentially going. Did you, in your lifetime, imagine that you would have to be fighting this good fight right now to explain to people what the re-election of Donald Trump really means?
Well, his first election did not surprise me. I dropped everything I was doing because I saw an opening for him to get to the White House, and I warned that he wants to be our dictator. And Donald, who I've known for 36 years, I wrote about him becoming president in 1988, knows nothing. He's appallingly ignorant, and he's a con artist. He's the most masterful con artist I've ever seen, and I've exposed lots of con artists over my long career. His comeback surprised me. We don't know yet, because it'll take time for political scientists and political professionals to sift through the data, but I suspect the most important factor in his second term, that he won by a very narrow margin, 1.5 percentage points, is the drop in the number of voters. 13 million people, so if you had population growth, 17 million people didn't show up in this election while they did previously. And of course, if people don't show up, it usually means either they feel they have no power or they're satisfied with what's going on. And given that America, as The Economist magazine in Britain has pointed out, has not just the strongest economy in the world, but is the envy of the world under Joe Biden, this election result is surprising. On the other hand, America is a country now where half of adults read at the level of a 5th grade child, half, and more than a fifth, around 22%, read at the level of an 8-year-old, a 3rd grader. So people who don't have reading skills, don't have critical thinking skills, can be easily manipulated, and they have been. And there's plenty of surveys showing that, for example, journalism students at Northwestern University put this together. In those counties in America with no newspaper, there are 3,300 counties in America, and hundreds of them now have no newspaper. Trump's margin of victory was in the neighborhood of 80 to more than 90%. People don't consume news, and they just rely on the PR pitches that they're getting. Then you end up with a result like this, which is a very grave danger to our republic. We may not, as a democracy, survive Donald Trump's return.
Just as an aside, how does America remain a superpower if, as you describe, the people in it are increasingly uneducated? How much of the country being a superpower on the world stage relates to the actual the number of people who are part of it? Because again, to me, that just talks to the 1%, or it talks to big business and talks to the Elon Musks of this country, who are actually holding the controlling stakes.
Well, we live in a very complicated and competitive world. Knowledge is power. Fundamentally, knowledge is power. And, I've been teaching for the last 15 years. I taught law at Syracuse University. I'm not a lawyer, but I was on the faculty teaching law there for 15 years. And now I teach at Rochester Institute of Technology as a professor. And I'm astonished at how students these days do not know things that were basic requirements to get out of junior high and high school when I was in school in the 50s and 60s. It's amazing. There are surveys showing Americans are asked on whose side did we fight in World War II, and the plurality pick with the Nazis against Russia. Just appalling ignorance about these things. And it's been going on now for quite a long time in America, that we have been dumbing down our education system. We've been withdrawing the arts. We kept football. And many schools no longer require students to read a novel. Reading a novel is critical to understanding what sociologists call the other. It's a way to learn why and how other people behave, what motivates them. But many high schools now, even for honors English, don't require you to read a novel, or maybe one at the most. And I know of schools and of individual teachers who show movies instead. Now, if you and I both read Harper Lee's novel, Atticus Finch in each of our minds is a different person. But if we watch the black and white film, we get a pre-digested Gregory Peck. And by the way, there are school districts where I live in Western New York that ban To Kill a Mockingbird because it's filthy.
So maybe we should talk just for a second about Trump's plan to deconstruct the Department of Education. This is a Christian nationalist decision, really, isn't it? This kind of comes from the Heritage Foundation, this idea that actually we can, in their desire to stop indoctrination, they want to indoctrinate in their own way.
Exactly correct, with one little caveat. Donald Trump has repeatedly called Christians fools, idiots, and schmucks, and he means that Yiddish word in the worst possible sense of it. He's not a Christian. He was asked on a radio show where I live 6 years ago or 8 years ago, when was the last time as a Christian you asked God for forgiveness? And Donald goes, what, forgiveness? Why would I do that? I've never done anything in my life requiring asking anyone for forgiveness, which should tell you all you need to know. But then you add in his repeated written and stated assertion that his life philosophy is a single word: revenge. Christianity utterly rejects revenge. You cannot call yourself a Christian honestly and believe in revenge. But the plan here, I think, is very, very clear. Attacking science, calling it a religion, asserting it's unverifiable, spreading messages like Dr. Fauci should be tried and put in prison because none of these 70-some vaccines in the United States was ever tested for safety and purity, which is pure, utter nonsense. The goal here is a top-down oligarchy run by white supremacists. Make America Great Again is really just cover for Make America White Again. And, over the years that I've covered Donald and known him, I've written many times about racist actions by him when he was a casino owner, as a landlord. His family has been steeped in racism from the get-go. And Donald on the campaign trail, at one point he pointed to a man and said, "That's my black man," as if he's property. Yeah. So the goal here is very, very clear. It's, in fact, indoctrinate people, take away access to things that would question abuse of power from the top. Don't let students read various books and novels. And from that, you can then remake the country into something unrecognizable as a democracy, but probably able to function just fine on an economic basis. China, after all, does it.
And the rest of the world is looking on in horror. Certainly the nations that are NATO member states, for example, who rely on the United States for their safety and for their security. And they are obviously concerned that maybe under the direction of Vladimir Putin, or who only knows who, Donald Trump will probably get to that end game of removing the US from NATO. Certainly that's how it feels. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I think that Trump very likely will move to follow through. One of the reasons Trump didn't do a lot of things in his first term is that he is an incompetent manager. As soon as I arrived in Atlantic City in 1988 from the Los Angeles Times, his own executives were ratting him out to me as a complete and utter incompetent, and I very quickly established that, he didn't know anything about his own business. He owned 2 casinos, but he knew nothing about the business. And so Trump has created this faux impression that he's this great business genius. Anybody who understands business, and I had an appointment in a graduate business school for 8 years after I retired from the New York Times, knows that his two shows, Celebrity Apprentice and Apprentice, what went on there would just kill any business. That's not how business works. But why would most people know that? They'd have no idea whatsoever about how business works. And so Donald didn't follow through on many things, partly because there were some people who stood in his way and said, you really don't want to do that, or this or that will happen. But I think he now feels emboldened. The courts have bowed down to him. You can't legally deport American citizens, and yet they are openly talking about deporting American citizens. So I think we're at great risk that Trump will turn out to be an actual dictator. And one of the signs of that would be found in our Fifth Amendment to our Constitution. Most Americans think if the police arrest you, you have a right to contact your lawyer or your family and to have a court hearing. That's not true. The Constitution says the privilege of habeas corpus shall not be suspended except in time of war or insurrection. Abraham Lincoln did it. And if Donald can find a way to create some violent response that's big enough, I can see him declaring this is an insurrection, suspending habeas corpus, which would allow him to arrest people he doesn't like and hold them incommunicado. And will the courts support that or not? Well, I don't trust this current Supreme Court majority. I trust lots of the judges Trump appointed to the bench. Many of them have turned out to be good judges. There's some awful ones in there, but many of them have been rooted in the law. But there are a number of things Trump can do that would diminish our democracy. The other big sign that we're going to become a dictatorship is if he starts firing generals and admirals and promoting officers out of turn, captains, majors, lieutenant colonels. That is one of the classic signs of an authoritarian government exercising control.
Well, he said he was going to fire any of the military that were involved in the withdrawal from Afghanistan because it was such a terrible operation in his opinion. So that could be the basis for that.
Well, he's also said that he's going to recall Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Right.
If you're a U.S. military officer, you are subject to recall to the age of 70. Milley is in his 60s. Now, to court-martial him, he's going to need generals and admirals to go along with this, and I think he'll have a much tougher time with that, and therefore he may not do it. But understand, Trump doesn't understand anything about the Constitution. He had to have it explained to him when he was president why there is a memorial over the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor. How you can grow up, not just in America, but where you did in the United Kingdom and not know about December 7, 1941 is astonishing and goes to how Donald is appallingly ignorant. So he has repeatedly said, I have an Article 2, that's the part of the Constitution governing the presidency. I have an Article 2 that says I can do anything I want. It says nothing of the kind, but if that's what Donald thinks, he will behave that way.
And lowering the bar that allows Donald Trump to be president twice. I mean, this is, again, feeds his ego and his narcissistic personality disorder that he can kind of win a second term. It kind of lowers the bar for future presidents, doesn't it? Because ignorant people will be like, well, if he can do it, then maybe I could too.
After Trump was elected, I've been in office about a year, I did a worldwide tour about my books on Donald Trump. And the most interesting thing I heard back from any of the lectures was from a man in Germany who said, well, you Americans, you've been very lucky. You went 200 years without having an absolutely crazy authoritarian get to the head of your government. To those of us who live in Europe, you just got lucky and now you're catching up with the rest of us. And while it was terribly cynical comment, I thought, yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. And of course, if you don't explain to people that your liberties depend on the liberties of people you don't like, then you're going to have a very hard time defending the liberties of the people. And Donald has no interest in liberties of the people. He has said, you shouldn't be allowed to write something about me unless I approve.
And we've started to see that with the ABC News settlement, $15 million, because Trump was described as a rapist when he didn't like that description, despite the adjudicated rapist decision. This is just the beginning of this spiral, really, isn't it? Where the integrity of journalism, which of course he describes as fake news or the enemy of the people, this is going to come to a head in this next regime, isn't it?
Yes. ABC, we don't know exactly why ABC folded in the case they would have won.
Yes.
But ABC has many, many interests, including a television network beyond ABC. It has theme parks that can be subject to all sorts of federal regulatory interference and other interests.
We should remind people that ABC's parent company is Disney, and they also have government contracts, apparently.
Well, actually, Disney owns ABC.
Sorry, other way
around. The parent
around.
company is Disney. At one time, it was the other way around.
Yeah.
Yes, they have contracts with the government like Elon Musk and a number of other people. But I expect that Trump will bring civil actions against my former newspaper, the New York Times. They may bring criminal actions. They will do everything they can to harass and harry that newspaper. I also expect it will stand up, but everybody won't. We've seen that the publishers of the Los Angeles Times, Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, and the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, killed editorials supporting Kamala Harris. Now, the editorial page belongs to the publisher. In my view, publisher is entitled to whatever he wants. You don't like it, that's fine. I mean, when I was an investigative reporter at the LA Times, there were mornings I woke up and there's an editorial in the paper that, without naming me, says, yeah, we don't think this is what's going on, and would dump on their own story. That's fine. They're entitled to do that.
Yeah.
Both publishers did allow the news departments to report on this robustly, but that doesn't mean that will continue. And the federal government's levers to bring businesses to knee is, I think, something Americans don't fully appreciate. Much of my career, I focused on regulatory law and how regulations you've never heard of take money out of your pocket or deny you things. And that machine can be used not just for good, not just for extracting money from people, that's an abuse of it, but it can also be used for government to punish and suppress corporations that don't bow down to Donald Trump. Voluntary obedience, which is what Disney did in the ABC News case, is one of the worst things you can do. It signals to other people that you're a coward. It signals to the oligarch or the dictator or the wannabe dictator that they have more power than they actually do.
So on that, David, let's talk about democracy in the US now, because I've been saying for a while that democracy has already fallen, and we've seen a lot of people have certainly said that this election didn't really feel like a proper election because of the disinformation campaign, the amount of money that people like Elon Musk spent on trying to buy votes, $1 million at a time in some cases. And also, going alongside with that, we have this rise of dictatorship, which also many Americans refuse to accept either. So is it American exceptionalism that prevents some people from accepting or acknowledging that democracy has fallen or can fall and that dictatorship can rise here?
Well, democracies all around the world have been in trouble for some time. When I was doing lots of lectures 15 years ago, I would tell the audience that there was this tsunami of authoritarianism building, and I felt like I was putting my hand up to stop it, which is, of course, totally useless. But what else is there to do? But when great social tides come along, they have to play themselves out. After the plague in Europe, the church losing its iron control of the populace, for example, that had to play out. And democracy requires people who are engaged about their government, who feel that they are citizens, not just occupants of an area. And yet both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan said in slightly different language, there's no society here. We're 300 million people occupying this territory in the United States. And that has weakened the connections and the bonds that allow people to work out their differences and reach compromise. And then, of course, Newt Gingrich in 1994, when he was House Speaker, popularized this idea that bipartisanship and cooperation is what he called political date rape.
And the tragedy is that we are almost now so polarized that it seems like we've gone beyond the point of no return.
Oh, I don't think that. I mean, after all, America survived a civil war. It survived having a murderous president of the United States in Andrew Jackson, whose portrait, by the way, Trump hung in the Oval Office when he was president.
Yeah, big fan.
We survived the Great Fear after World War II. This is not at all hopeless, and Trump didn't win by some huge margin. If Trump's economic policies do what I and other people understand economics expect, which is make economic growth slow down or likely reverse, increase inflation, particularly for food, and start trade wars in which Trump seems not to appreciate that China and Mexico and Canada and others can retaliate against us, that should wake some people up, get some people to go turn out to vote. And so it'll take 2 years to get a new House. We could change the control of the Senate in 2 years, and it's a much better table for the Democrats in 2026 than it was this year. But we also could absolutely fail, and we can end up being a dictatorship. From the fall of Rome took 40 years. We have this misleading sort of belief in the modern world because of news that things happen right away. No, they don't. For weeks before the attack on Fort Sumter that began the Civil War in the United States, there were news accounts saying, when are they going to attack? When are they going to attack? This ship arrived today and these soldiers arrived, and when are they going to attack? These things don't suddenly happen out of nowhere. 9/11 didn't even come out of nowhere if you'd been paying attention to Osama bin Laden, but very, very few people do, and most of those were avid readers of the New York Times, which had reported about this.
The disconnect in this last election was that the economy was doing better on paper, but not in person. And so Donald Trump kind of seized on that and claimed that he'll bring prices down and he'll bring inflation down. He'll obviously take credit for Joe Biden's economy over the next 2 years because of the approximately 2-year lag on a lot of these policies. So is there going to be a wake-up call? Will there be buyer's remorse? I mean, how do you think that will play out when things do get more expensive and Donald Trump doesn't have control over them?
Well, I've been arguing that a smart strategy here is let Trump be Trump, LTBT, let Trump be Trump, because his policies won't work. They can't work. So let him do that, and people will pay the pain for not understanding and for not understanding how the economy works, how politics works. But it will take several years. I absolutely agree. Anything good will be claimed as the successes of Donald Trump. And people forget that under Joe Biden, the economy literally was much better. From 2022 to 2023, the median income, that's half make more, half make less. It's very typical of what people make as opposed to the average, which can be skewed way up because of people with literally multi-billion-dollar annual incomes, not wealth, incomes. The bottom half's income rose 20% faster than society overall. I do these numbers every year for 30 years. This is a sharp change where the bottom was gaining and the top wasn't. And but it takes years for things like that to play through. The decline of the 90% in America began in 1974 after a peak in 73, but we really didn't see the strong effects of that until more than 30 years had passed. So these things do take time. But Donald's authoritarian impulses in other areas using the military as he's promised to do against American citizens, deporting American citizens, deporting students who protest on campus. Those things probably will come back, hopefully will come back to wake people up to this loss of liberty and this notion that we're going to tell you what you can read, what products you can buy, what medical drugs and other medical interventions will be available to you. That over time shouldn't play particularly well. On the other hand, look, the American people have the right to overthrow their democracy and create a dictatorship. The Constitution has a method for doing it. You just over time change the government and change the rules. Hopefully people just aren't that gullible and dumb, but we don't know in this era.
It will be a problem when it comes to things like public health, because things like mask mandates or vaccinations, that's what saved, despite the death of 1.2 million Americans, so many more were saved because of mask mandates and vaccinations. And yet those things have been weaponized, meaning that when there is another pandemic, there will be an increasing number of Trump voting people who will be like, you won't make me wear a mask, you won't make me get vaccinated. And the effect of that could be devastating.
Well, Donald Trump's grandfather died during the 1918 flu epidemic.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Interesting.
And his father, Fred, was only 13 years old at the time, and it very much shaped who Fred became, which shaped who Donald became. You would think Donald Trump would have some appreciation of these things. He did get the very first doses of the vaccines that saved many, many lives, and it was because of vaccines and public health measures that the number of people who died in America, bad as it was, 1.2 million, it's about, in round numbers, about 1.1 million gratuitous deaths because of Donald Trump's incompetence, without any vaccines would have been much, much worse. And now he wants to put Robert F. Kennedy, a nutcase if there ever was one in public life, in charge of American health care. And this is a man who says vaccines cause harm. And the only vaccine he has hedged on is the polio vaccine. There are, 2-3 cases in the world, maybe a half a dozen these days of polio. The virus is still out there, but children are not being paralyzed. Nobody lives in an iron lung anymore. All the children who were in those and grew to be old, they're all dead now. Why did Robert F. Kennedy back off on the polio vaccine? Because Mitch McConnell, the senior senator from Kentucky, had polio, and it deformed him when he was a child. And he doesn't need that fight. So he's, like Donald, feral enough to back off on this one thing. But hey, listen, if you're a fan of measles and mumps and rubella and you want to have children who are blind, young boys who grow up to be sterile, this is a great administration and you should support them fully.
And things like PFAS, we're hearing about plastics in our food and in our brains and in our testicles even. I mean, we're getting a level of information now about the effects of deregulation. If we deregulate the Environmental Protection Agency and any of these departments that keep us safe, again, this is about owning the libs from the Republicans' perspective, but they're actually signing their own death wish.
So, Anthony, I want to get you to not use that word, deregulation. There is no such thing as deregulation. There is only re-regulation. And the history of America, going back to Jimmy Carter, is the re-regulation takes away from consumers, takes away from customers, and from investors, and from workers, and imbues power and authority and the freedom to be abusive to those people who own the companies, those people who run the institutions. So everything is regulated. One of the things I've always taught my students is, everything is regulated. Say, this university, like every other university in America, regulates dating. And it takes them a while, even the third-year law students, it takes them a while, and they go, oh, sexual harassment, that is kind of regulating dating, isn't it? Baseball regulates how many stitches are on the ball, the color of the yarn, and the material that the yarn is made with. Everything is regulated in some way. So when people say deregulation, they're trying to get you to not see what's happening, which is reducing your rights and privileges and expanding those of the people who have got more power and political influence than you do. And by the way, one of the reasons this came about was during the Nixon years, we had these scandals about money, people with $250,000 of cash in safes and spending money on disrupting campaigns with various vicious activities. So there were reforms put in place. I wrote about those reforms back at the time in the 70s. They've backfired. They have imbued the billionaire class, the centimillionaire class, with enormous power far beyond what they had back then. It was a good example of the liberals not thinking through the consequences of their reforms. And we're paying a terrible price for this, where people like Elon Musk is the de facto president of the United States at the moment.
Right.
And when Donald Trump finally realizes that everybody thinks that about him, not just liberals, he will break with Elon Musk. But we have allowed people with money, and thanks to the Supreme Court in a series of decisions, the worst of which was Citizens United, but there were predecessor decisions to this, to essentially say that money is speech and money is political influence. Democracy,
well, the Chevron case is very similar to this too.
Absolutely. And democracies don't live in a world in which money rules. When the Athenians set up their democracy 2,500 years ago, the big issue was, well, wait a minute, the rich have always run things. How can we possibly do this? And so they broke people up into factions. They changed the leadership 10 times a year. And, by the way, they honored the people who paid the big, heavy taxes when they adopted a progressive tax structure. You know, which I'm perfectly in favor of. Let's have a statue to Elon Musk. Oh, wait a minute, he doesn't pay any federal income tax. Well, Bezos, he doesn't pay. Michael Bloomberg, he pays a lot of taxes. We should put up a statue to him.
The problem with re-regulation is that it plays into this kind of this underscore of libertarianism, where people in America, they don't want government intervention or government control. They think that life would be better without it. How do we get to the point where that is a kind of rhetoric that MAGA Republicans have seized upon? Because that's really the currency now, isn't it?
Yeah. First of all, libertarians are a small fringe group in America, but they've had a lot of influence in getting people to get this notion that government interferes in your life and socialism bad. Let me see. We have socialist roads. We have socialist military. We have socialist police, socialist prosecutors, socialist fire departments. All of those seem to be fine with people.
Yeah, right.
And you know, when I've spoken at union halls, I've had members of the UAW and the IBEW and others get up and say, "What's the union ever done for me?" And I go, "Well, do you get weekends off? Do you get overtime pay? Do you have a pension plan? You have a health care plan?" "Well, it's not as good as it used to be." I said, "Well, that's because the union's weaker and they've had to make concessions." You know, Pope Francis said 10 years ago, there is no economic justice without unions. And in America, unfortunately, we have many, many people who claim to be Christians, who are pastors, but they actually don't preach Christianity at all. They preach white supremacy, hatred, rejection of the other. The reason there's poor people is people who shouldn't be having children or breeding, and other concepts that are antithetical to Christianity. But they have a lot of sway and influence. And so I think that we have an enormous job in this country of rebuilding an understanding of what democracy is, of what liberty is, of why it's necessary to defend the rights of people you can't stand if you want your own freedoms. And the Democrats, to get at this, have got to get off of their focus on what are relatively fringe issues. They need to go back to core economic issues. RAND, which was set up as an Air Force think tank, did a study that demonstrated, I think quite persuasively, that $50 trillion, that's almost 2 years of the entire output of the American economy, has been redistributed over the last half century from ordinary people to those at the very top. I've written best-selling books explaining the mechanisms, which are technically they're not secret, but trust me, it took a long time for me to figure these things out. They're not obvious in the law books when you read them, where companies reach into your pocket every day. There's one industry in America, the pipeline industry, I wrote 15 years ago, 3 cents a day from everybody in America. Congress ordered up a study because of that, and they said, well, you're wrong. It's 2 cents a day. Well, a penny a day from everybody in America is $1.2 billion a year, and it's going to about 175 people. So we have this, it's a larger group now, 175 entities, but it's not even the investors in these entities in the pipelines. It's the top management control group that get the money. And I don't know about you, but if my experience is that trying to get people to go out and demonstrate in the streets over being ripped off for a family of 4 for a dime or so a day just doesn't play. It's not enough to be upset about. But, a penny here and a nickel there and a dime over there and $1 a day in another place, and pretty soon you're not well off, and some other people are richer than anybody could have imagined when I started out as a reporter in 1966, beyond anybody's imagining. And it's the control of government, of the rules in the government rule book that enable this. Now, some of it happens because of new technologies and discoveries. That always happens. But that doesn't explain much of this. The other thing Americans don't understand at all is that more than half of the economic growth in the United States since 1945, when World War II ended, is due to taxpayer investments in science. Taxpayer investments, but, we can't spend money, not supposed to do that. Basic research, not applied research, but basic fundamental, how does the universe work research, that's only funded by governments. AT&T did some of it, but they were a proxy for the government when they were a national monopoly. But if you don't understand anything about the economy, if you don't understand anything about where ideas come that change the world, then, you can be like the Luddites. Oh, we have to go smash the looms because they're taking our jobs away, not realizing if people can buy a lot more clothing and it'll be a lot less expensive, you might be better off. And I got to hand it to the authoritarian elements in the Republican Party that they have been very successful.
They've won the messaging war, haven't they? I mean, that's what's been so clever.
The Democrats don't know how to message. And Nancy Pelosi and I have had words about this nose to nose. She's going to go down in history as the greatest Speaker of the House so far of all time, way ahead of anybody else. But on the other hand, she walks around in $4,000 dresses and $1,000 high heels, and then is surprised that working people think that she's a tool of the rich.
Is there some truth in, because of the American dream and all of this culture that is unique to the United States, that some people think that they want a billionaire to be the leader, and that the idea that people like this broligarchy that we're discovering are better for America than just civil servants?
I think a lot of people, in fact, do have that idea that, Adam Smith, the man who figured out competitive market capitalism in 1776, says in his other famous book about moral sentiments that people tend to worship those with money and to despise those of what he called mean condition, meaning that they were poor. And this is a fundamental flaw in the human character. But very much so, we're seeing people saying, well, he has a lot of money, therefore he must know what he's doing. Never mind that, how you got your fortune could be ripping people off, which is what Donald Trump did. And, there's not a word in the U.S. Constitution about wealth and riches. The U.S. Constitution is about liberty, about an ordered society that protects individual rights and that allows the human spirit to grow. And let's see what we can do in a society that ennobles the human spirit. But lots of people really believe the purpose of the U.S. government is to get rich. Well, if that happens and we get into a war again like World War II, what you're going to notice is young men are not going to line up to go get themselves killed in a war because nobody's going to go to war to protect rich people's riches.
And this plays into that argument that you can't run a country like a business that seems to have been overlooked with the rise of Trump.
Right. Well, I don't want government to be a business, and I don't think anybody else does if they think about it. Corporations are very useful things. They've proven to be incredibly valuable. But a corporation is there to make money. It's not, by the way, there to make money for the shareholders. That's a mistaken belief Milton Friedman sold the public through an article he wrote for the New York Times Magazine in 1971. That's a whole other discussion we can have. But the purpose of our Constitution is not to get rich. Getting rich is a byproduct of that. And if we don't care about each other, and that doesn't mean just Americans, you have to care about the world as a whole, then you're going to end up eventually with the people who have money making the rules. And they're not going to make the rules on behalf of those who don't have money.
It's so interesting to me how Musk and Bezos, I mean, for British people, these characters would be the baddies. You know, we're quite distrusting of wealthy people because, you know, the way that wealth is not celebrated in the UK as it is in the US. Right. And yet we have a monarchy, and, you know, people statistically are quite warm to the monarchy. And
your government just voted to eliminate peerages. The people who, because they are given an aristocratic title, inherit a right to be in the upper house of Parliament. That's being removed. And we've known for 25 years that British society, which we think of as very class-oriented, is much more mobile than American society. If you're born poor in Britain, you have a better chance of getting into the top fifth than you do if you're born poor in America.
And so this concept of social mobility, it's not something I hear much about here in the US, but we talked about it all the time in the UK. And again, there are, you know, the countries are so different. You know, people think that we're similar by nature of the language, but you and I suppose age, you know, the age of a country plays into this quite a lot too. The UK obviously has been through not just wars and civil wars and uprisings and takeovers and everything else, great fires and plagues, but also the United States is a freshman, really, when it comes to political history.
Children in Britain are taught a much more honest history of their country than American children are taught of their country.
Yeah.
If you go to Boston into the blue collar neighbors, you can find people sitting in a bar who will tell you, you know, my great grandfather, who was one of the people at the Boston Tea Party. And the reason people can do that is everybody thinks that names aren't known. Now, fly over to London, go to the British Library, not the museum, the British Library, and you can read the Portmaster's report back to the Crown, in which he names who was there because he knew these people. It's not a secret. So we have this long history in the U.S. of not teaching an honest history. There's an excellent book about it called Lies My Teacher Taught Me. And, you know, we almost published a textbook in the United States, but for a story in the New York Times that derailed it. It was going to teach that the people who came here enslaved were workers seeking better opportunity.
Yeah, but we've heard Trump talk about this. We've heard MAGA Republicans use that rhetoric in the election campaign, and there wasn't enough pushback, in my opinion. But then again, you know, in the UK, we're not taught that America won the Second World War for us, and yet I hear that a lot here.
Well, absolutely, and we give almost no credit to the Russians, who are absolutely crucial. And there are these surveys taken that show large numbers of Americans believe we fought with the Nazis against Russia in World War II, which tells you we're not transmitting these things. Now, these are not unique to the United States. I have met with East Indians in their 20s who are college educated, who don't know anything about, really seriously, about Gandhi. They don't know about Amritsar and General Dyer opening a machine gun up on praying women and children, or many other things that happened to get the British to leave. So I think this is a worldwide phenomenon that we are not doing a good job of transmitting values and knowledge about the culture and politics and economics. You know, China is still a poor country. Its economy, by some measures, is bigger now than that of the U.S., but because of much larger population, people are not nearly as well off. But even very poor people in China have savings.
Yes.
Many Americans have no savings whatsoever. They don't have $400. If the transmission falls out of their car, they don't know what they're going to do to get to work. And that's not prudent. Teaching prudence, it's something I stress on all my students and have for years, is be prudent. Things will work out well if you're prudent. But if you just think, as some of my journalism friends did, they drove fancy cars and took expensive vacations every year, and now they're in their 70s like me, and I don't have any money. I'm going to have to sell my house and move into a little apartment. Yeah, because you weren't prudent. We're not teaching prudence in American society. We're teaching borrow. People were putting liens on their houses through home equity loans to buy cars. What? I mean,
even the subprime mortgage crash is an example of this, right? That could only happen in a society that was prepared to over-leverage to such an extent that it ended up blowing a hole in the rest of the world.
And to put in place an administration that allowed the banks to stop underwriting mortgages.
Too big to fail.
Too big to fail is sort of the secondary effect of it. But the George W. Bush administration pulled off all the rules on lending. And it used to be when a bank issued a mortgage to you, they held it in their portfolio. So they had a very serious interest in making sure the mortgage was appropriate to the value of the property. But once we developed these devices where you sell them in a bundle of 10,000, and then assume you're one of the 10,000 buyers, Anthony, and you come in and you say, hey, I lost my job. I need some forbearance. Can we do something about my loans? The bank doesn't want to foreclose on your house, so they work something out with you. They might loan you more money at a higher interest rate to keep you going until you get you back on your feet. But once you have these collateralized mortgages, the bank says, well, I'm sorry, under the rules, we can't change any one of the mortgages unless we change them all, so there's nothing we can do for you.
Right.
We replaced many virtuous financial policies with vicious policies, replacing limited partnerships in which every partner is equally liable for the misconduct of any partner with something called limited liability companies, where if I think you're doing crooked things, Anthony, in our business, as long as I don't stick my nose in and find out about it, I'm protected. But if I go in and say, hey, what are you doing here? I can now lose my house. That's a vicious policy. And my economics trilogy, Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and The Fine Print, which are all still in print, go through these policies and show how we put in place these policies that, calling them deregulation when they're re-regulation, damage ordinary people, put them at risk, make them bear burdens they're not fit to bear, and insulate people who take outrageous risks.
What you're exposing is that there is a whole lot more to making a decision as to who to vote for than just owning the libs, trans bathrooms, or the price of eggs. And that really is the greatest confidence trick that has been played in the last decade, right?
The idea that people voted for George W. Bush over Al Gore because they'd rather have a beer with George W. Bush. If I had to choose, I would too.
Yeah.
Al Gore was an automaton, but he was also a fellow who could have easily gotten out of the war in Vietnam and instead signed up and demanded he be sent there as a grunt, by the way, not an officer, which he could have done. Demanded he be allowed to go into the battlefield, even if they tightly restricted it to minimize his danger, because his father basically was in charge of the military budget in Congress. John Kerry invented a new military strategy that saved many lives. How many, there's no way to quantify it to my knowledge, but a new military strategy that was adopted and saved American lives. And he gets treated as a coward and unworthy of the medals he got. There's something very sick going on in American society among people who value money over everything else. And there's nothing wrong with money. I'm a poster boy for being poor when I was a kid and being a very prosperous man now. But money is just a means to an end. Martin Luther King said he wanted his 4 children to grow up in a world where they would be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Well, we've ended up with a society that judges people by the content, or in the case of Donald Trump, the imaginary content of your wallet. And how much money you have has nothing to do with who you are. There are rich people who are saints and there are poor people who are monsters, but the reverse is also true. But we don't see that. And that was this great insight of Adam Smith in his theory of our moral sentiments about admiring people because they have money. No. Nothing wrong with making money and being prudent and investing, but you don't admire people just because they have money. You admire people because they have character, they have integrity, because they're brave, because they take care of other people around them who need help. That's what we should be admiring. And yet, look what's happened. And our value system is really at the core of what's gone wrong in America. I believe we can recover from this, but it will not be easy. It will not happen overnight. It may not, by the time I'm dead, it may not be fixed yet, because it took us 50 years to get into this, and we're not going to get out of it in 2 elections or 3 election cycles.
We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk about the irony that 2 billionaires are the ones that are going to try and save $2 trillion from the public purse, and why that might have been overlooked somewhat. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. How's your holiday season shopping going? Mine is slow, but it is the season to liven up dinner, and you could gift an endless variety of tasty food from award-winning chefs with Cook Unity. That's right, dozens of chefs offering a wide variety of cuisine. You can select from over 350 meals or have them pick them for you. Made, prepared, and delivered right to your door. Easy and effortless. Choose from hundreds of meals. No cleanup, no meal planning. Meals delivered fully cooked. Just heat in as little as 5 minutes. Flexible, commitment-free subscriptions. Skip deliveries, pause or cancel anytime. It does sound like the perfect gift for the holidays. Their roster of all-star chefs includes James Beard Award winners, acclaimed restaurateurs, balancing flavor and nutrition in small batch meals sent fresh and not frozen. Give the gift of delivering mouth-watering meals crafted by local ingredients and award-winning chefs with Cook Unity. Go to cookunity.com/weekend and enter code WEEKEND before checkout for 50% off your first week. That's 50% off your first week using code WEEKEND or by going to cookunity.com/weekend. We're back with David Cay Johnston here on The Weekend Show. I'm Anthony Davis. Just before the break, we kind of were talking about this respect for the billionaire class and how great riches seem to be the thing that people strive for. And yet here we have 2 billionaires in Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk given this kind of non-cabinet position, Doge they're calling it, to try and save America's public purse, reduce it significantly. And I was saying that, it's not lost on me that these extremely wealthy individuals who have never needed to touch any of these public services or entitlements that they're probably likely to strip are the ones who are responsible for that.
Well, this is a curious development. One thing most Americans do not want to hear, and I can tell you this from kickback that I've gotten for years, all wealthy societies have relatively high taxes, because private wealth creation requires massive investments of public funds. You have to have an educated society. You have to have roads. You have to have water treatment and sewage treatment so people don't get sick and die. You have to have a whole civil infrastructure, what I call the public furniture, in order to have private wealth creation. People have this magical notion you do it on your own. No, you don't. And if the tax system taxes a secretary more heavily, that is a larger share of her income than it does Elon Musk, guess what? The secretary will never be able to become a business owner.
This is the Warren Buffett rule. That's
exactly the Warren Buffett rule. And he's exactly right about that. When Barack Obama had his encounter in Toledo, in a neighborhood, with Joe the plumber, if you see the entire extended clip that's on the internet, not the little snippet that ran on the nightly news, Barack Obama essentially, from memory, recites one of my books to him and points out that under his tax plan, Joe the plumber would be able to put together the money much sooner to start a business. And what becomes very clear as you watch the extended clip is Joe the plumber isn't interested in learning anything. He doesn't want to hear anything. He just wants to be reinforced in what he believes is already true. Now, journalists and detectives are trained that you go wherever the facts are. And many times in my life, I've been, wow, that's not what I thought at all. But you have to then adapt to what the facts are. Politicians don't have to do that. And Donald Trump creates his own reality. And by that, I mean, he lives in this fictional universe in his head where whatever he says is the way it is. And if he contradicts himself 30 seconds later and you point that out, well, I never said that. And he sees no contradiction in that because he lives in this fictional world in his head. He's not the only person I've known in public life who does this, but he's the most extreme example by far.
Well, I was going to say it's a new thing because there isn't the pushback by nature of him not exposing himself to journalism.
Exactly the point I wanted to get to, okay. Anthony. You got right there, so I'm feeling good. Donald doesn't sit anymore for interviews with people like me.
Yeah.
Okay? I mean, I spend many, many hours with Donald Trump, but he doesn't have the integrity or the strength of character to sit down for an interview with me because he knows that I don't say things I can't back up, and he knows I study deeply the things that I read about. A lot of things I don't know anything about. Things I know very deeply. And he only talks to people who are sycophantic. So Sean Hannity is probably his favorite journalist in the world. He said he hates me more than any other journalist in the world. He said it several times.
Congratulations.
But the American people are unfortunately fed a somewhat namby-pamby version of politics by American news organizations. You will read much more robust debate about the war in Gaza in Israeli newspapers than you will in any American newspaper. And this is a real problem, is this sort of, well, we want to take the blunt edge off of that. We want to be a little careful. People will misunderstand it. So we don't have the kind of robust debate that would be important and useful. And so you have someone that comes along like AOC, the congresswoman from Brooklyn or Queens, and she presents things that are outside of the sort of accepted stream, and immediately it becomes important to discredit her rather than, let's put your ideas out in the marketplace. If they're bad ideas, the public presumably will come along and see that. What Donald's trying to do is the opposite of that. Anything that's a good idea that doesn't fit his agenda, that has to be suppressed.
But AOC is branded a radical, which I find remarkable, really, because everything she's saying, as far as I read it, is normal by any other standard.
Well, conservatives in Britain would in the United States be considered moderate liberals.
Correct.
And you go to the Scandinavian countries and they're my friends in Norway and Sweden are like, what is going on?
And yet Norway and Sweden always top the charts for the happiest societies, for the safest societies, the most robust societies. Taxation is high, healthcare is available and free at the point of access. And so we rarely reference Sweden as an example, which kind of is at the number one spot for all of this stuff.
16 years ago in Stockholm, when I was researching a book, I got into a conversation with a dozen tour bus drivers who had a couple of hours while the clients were off, having lunch and shopping in the stores. And we're talking to them. The prime minister walks by us. Every one of these bus drivers, they were all in their 50s or 60s. They had all retired, and they decided either they didn't have quite enough money or their spouse wanted them out of the house, not being around all the time. These bus drivers each owned 2 homes with no mortgages. I mean, I said to one of them, I said, you're a bus driver. How do you afford 2 homes? How do you pay the mortgage? He goes, mortgage? Did I say anything about mortgage?
Right.
I don't have a mortgage. And I said, how about the rest of you? We don't have mortgages. They paid for their houses. The odds in the U.S. that you could go to any large city and find a dozen bus drivers standing around that one of them would own one house free and clear are close to nil. People don't understand that if the government buys things wholesale, like healthcare and retirement, and properly invests in things like the quality of roads and infrastructure and whatnot, that you'll actually be better off. The people who live in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, and they get that.
But those nations are social democracies.
Yes, and they're not perfect. The Sami people in Norway, I'm mostly Norwegian. The Sami people in Norway, they will tell you they're just horribly discriminated against, and they are, as a factual matter. Yeah. These aren't ideal societies in every way, but they get fundamental human economics right in a way Americans don't understand at all.
So the word socialism, which has been packed into a group with Marxism and communism, things that Trump liked to say on the campaign trail about Democrats, which is, of course, entirely untrue. It would be nice if we even got close to a social democracy here in the US. How do you think the branding of that became so misunderstood and weaponized?
Well, I think this use of socialism and confusing it with communism has been going on now for as long as the Russian Revolution in 1914. I mean, this is not new, but it certainly deeply infects people. And let's remember that many of the people who came to America from Europe came because they were excluded from the guilds, the European unions. And so to get ahead, to get into an occupation where they would make more money, they had to leave Europe because these were designed to limit the number of people with a skill. In the early days of the United States, organizing to ask your boss for a raise was literally a criminal offense. Up until 1842, courts consistently held that essentially unions were criminal organizations, despite the right of assembly and petition in the U.S. Constitution. These are words that are just triggers. There's no deep understanding of what they are. I get called a communist or a socialist all the time, and I say, yeah, right. And that's why I wrote a trilogy of best-selling books championing competitive market capitalism, because competitive market capitalism has turned out to be a very good idea. It may not be the best idea of all time, but so far it's done the most to benefit people. And by the way, in America, we don't have competitive market capitalism. We have corporate socialism. And I've explained this many times to people. What do you mean we have corporate socialism? Well, if you got 3 companies or 6 big banks and the government bails them out when they screw up, that's socialism on a corporate scale. So Americans are, by and large, are incredibly, appallingly ignorant about politics, economics, culture. I have had better conversations with a cop I met on the roadside in Slovakia looking for directions, a random person who sat down next to me on the couch of a hotel in Singapore, a waitress in a Bavarian roadside cafe. You had to drive up a dirt road off the highway, than with American multimillionaire executives.
So let's talk to that for a second, because one of these American multimillionaire executives has managed to get himself elected as president again, and his economic policies and plans for America's coffers are based on one policy and one policy only, which is tariffs. He hasn't really spoken about any other mechanisms for raising revenue. In fact, he wants to reduce corporation tax from 23 to 15%, I think.
21 to 15.
21 to 15%. And the only really way to offset that is, in his opinion, is to overcharge everybody else. And yet the American consumer is the one who's likely to be paying for these. And somehow that was whitewashed from the election campaign too. Over to you.
So Anthony, let me break this into 2 pieces.
Yeah.
Many American corporations literally turn a profit off the income tax through deferral. And when I reported this in the New York Times 23 years ago, I mean, the paper was just flooded with people saying, who is this crazy person? Congress then did a study, 1,800-page study, 3 volumes, that showed I was exactly right. Because if you can defer paying a tax you owe on this year's profits 30 years into the future, and you invest that money, at the end of the day, there's no interest on the tax you didn't pay. It's an interest-free loan from the government of the tax money. And with the earnings you'll make, you'll be much, much richer, 2, 3, 4 times richer, delaying the tax. So that's part one. People don't understand that. Here's the second part, though. A tariff, Donald tells people, is we're going to tax China. China's going to pay. China isn't going to pay a penny. Mexico is not going to pay a penny. A tariff is the functional equivalent of a sales tax on the American consumer, but it isn't limited to the raspberries or tomatoes that come into our country from Mexico, the auto parts from Canada, and everything that comes from China. Imagine you own Anthony Davis Motors and you make the Davis Mobile and you sell your cars wholesale for $10,000 each and you make a $1,000 profit. That's a nice business. 10% of sales is your profit. Trump comes along, raises Chinese cars to $16,000 with his 60% tariff. You're going to raise your price to $15,000. Now your profit per car is $6,000. Now, because the car costs more, you might only sell a half as many, but your profit will be much greater. And if you only have to make half as many cars and you're making 3 times as much money, you're really doing well because your risk factor has declined. Donald Trump's tariffs are a massive scheme to loot the pockets of consumers and put that money into the pockets of the ownership class. Now, I wrote a piece about this for the New Republic, and I sent it around to all sorts of journalists I know, MSNBC, CNN, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, thinking, okay, now these folks will start to understand. They didn't think through their... Nope. Haven't seen any change. I've seen one passing report on the CBS Evening News that vaguely hinted at this, and that was it. Just a passing line nobody but somebody like me would have noticed. And so Donald has successfully sold many people on the idea that the way to lower your taxes is to make the Chinese government and Chinese companies pay the taxes. That's not how it works. But if you don't know anything, if you didn't have to study systems and economics and how taxes work, millions of Americans sincerely believe that the Boston Tea Party was a protest against high taxes, because that's what I was certainly taught in school. No, it was a protest against a tax favor, a tax exemption for the friends of King George. Everybody I know who went to school in Britain understands that. Right. Americans, they go, what?
Does Donald Trump know that these tariffs will be enriching his corporate donors and friends? No,
I don't think Donald has any. He has a degree in economics, and it was given to him by Penn. Yeah. He didn't earn it. I've spent many hours with Donald talking about matters of business and economics, and the degree to which he didn't know his own business is just absolutely appalling. There is one thing he said to me once that stuck with me, and shows how easily he goes to whatever he thinks will sell. The two of us were walking down the boardwalk in Ocean City in 1989, maybe 88. And I said, Donald, you employ a lot of people, thousands of people. What do you think about how we should finance healthcare? And he stopped. He turned to me and he said, healthcare should be like the road in front of your house. When you need it, you just drive your car on it. And I said, oh, so you believe in universal, no out-of-pocket healthcare? And he went, yeah. And I said, and because as a business owner, he says it gets, we had this discussion, I don't remember the details of it, but that it gets it off his back. It's not his concern anymore. And now, of course, he wants to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. And what does he have to replace it? Concepts of a new idea. He doesn't have anything. If we repeal the Affordable Care Act, many people will die. I expect one of my grown children to die because he's had a heart attack. He's a business owner. No one will insure him. He will be without insurance. So he can get emergency room care, but he can't get the kind of care that someone with heart disease needs to have. And Donald doesn't care. Donald doesn't know anything about this. Donald actually said repeatedly in the 2016 campaign, wages are too high. And shockingly, neither Biden nor Kamala Harris, or Tim Walz for that matter, hung that on him. None of them. The Republicans know how to sell. Okay? There's a British product called Brill Cream. And in the 50s and 60s, there were ads everywhere telling young men, put this grease in your hair and girls will be all over you. Nonsense, but it sold a lot of Brill Cream. In America, people have been sold this bill of goods by Donald. I created the greatest economy ever. No, you didn't. Joe Biden's economy was vastly better than yours and pretty quickly. I got these massive new investments, ExxonMobil, $25 billion. So you go to ExxonMobil's records. Oh, we announced 6 months earlier we're going to invest $25 billion.
Yeah. He did the same with Foxconn, which never didn't turn out to be
which just became a pile of mud in Wisconsin.
Right. Yeah.
And journalists don't go back to the places. What about the jobs he supposedly saved in Indiana? Yeah, they're all gone. They all went to Mexico, just as was planned. They just were delayed a little bit.
So is it worth asking why journalists and news networks, mainstream corporate-owned news networks, are not willing to dig any deeper regarding the tariff confidence trick? Because, is this the same as the ABC payoff? Does this just go back to leverage?
Well, first, let me just lay out. I'm a former president of Investigative Reporters and Editors. That's the organization of people who do what I do. There's more than 6,000 of us. So it's a little credentialing here, okay? There are reporters who've done excellent work about Trump's economics. But most of the coverage comes from generalist journalists. They could be sent out to cover a murder case or an airplane crash or economics, and they don't know what they're doing. I read stories in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the time about business matters, where I go, that's a very readable story, and the journalist doesn't have a clue to what's really going on here. He's telling you what the sources he interviewed and the press releases tell him, but his level of knowledge is mechanical. Very few journalists have a knowledge at the level of principle and theory. You rarely find a reporter covering City Hall who, before they started the assignment, sat down and read the city charter. Even though, to me, that's like the first thing you do. You read the city charter, and then you get out the Oxford English Dictionary and you look up the history of the words you're going to deal with, police, handcuffs, arrest, etc. Most journalism is a very accurate accounting of what the journalists were told. It's superficial, and it does not go any deeper because the journalist doesn't have the knowledge to do it. Many journalists in the U.S. have never read the U.S. Constitution, which all in all, it's only about 7,000 words. It's not that much. They're shocked when they find things like there's a reference to letters of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E. What's that? Most people would say. By the way, that's authorizing pirates. Our Constitution allows the government to authorize pirates. So you can't write about what you don't know. It's the same thing novelists are told. Write what you know.
Yes.
Not what you don't know. And so it's superficial. And then secondly, nobody ever got in trouble for following the herd. Years ago, when I was in San Francisco for the LA Times, I went to a hearing about a wife beating. And there was a woman coming whose story became the subject of a movie whose husband had raped her and she killed him. But before that woman came on, when I was the only journalist in the room, 3 wealthy women, very nicely dressed women in their 40s, testified about how their husband's a bank CEO and a business owner and something else like that, a famous lawyer, beat the crap out of him all the time. So my story was about wife beating is not a class issue. Men at all levels do it. Every other story out of that hearing, when all the other journalists came, was all about the one case. And my editor, this hardly ever happened at the LA Times, killed my story and ran a wire service story. When I asked the next day what's going on, he proceeded to tell me that that's nonsense. Rich men don't beat their wives. Upper class men, middle class men don't beat their wives. I found out much later he was a wife beater. But the going with the herd will never get you in trouble. So to this day, stories appear saying that the alternative minimum tax was imposed by Congress so that super rich people couldn't pile on lots of exotic deductions and pay no income tax. That law was repealed in 1986, and it was replaced by a new law. And the new law, that's why it's called the alternative minimum tax, goes after married couples who own their own house and have more than 2 children. That's who it goes after, not rich people. Yet it appears all the time. And when I call or write to somebody as an editor, they come back and say, well, it's just shorthand. We have to have shorthand in journalism. Well, I understand that, but it should be accurate shorthand. And so, as I said, nobody ever got in trouble for saying what the herd is saying.
And that's only going to get worse with the rise of AI, and even the copy and paste buttons have changed journalism as long as I've been in it, whereby material is regurgitated and actual original writings are few and far between. And
Right.
and obviously that's very frustrating, but because there's so much to say, there's so much to push back on, there's so much to investigate. And I suppose that for some of us was the frustration of the Democratic campaign, is that there was so much to say about the opposition, so much to call Donald Trump out on, and yet there was a very kind of alternative and holistic view of America that didn't quite chime with enough people.
Well, Harris should have gone after Trump and said, incomes are rising now, they weren't rising then. The reason you're not feeling it is because you were so down when Donald was in the White House.
Right.
And handed out the numbers, had charts behind her, very simple charts. Should have said, Donald Trump says wages are too high. Instead, her campaign came across as being too much focused on transgender rights and issues like that are
inclusivity and diversity,
most people on the margin.
Yeah.
To most people, they're on the margin. Hillary Clinton, when she ran, what I perceived in that campaign is that Donald would get up and say things that resonated with people. They felt them in their stomachs or their hearts. Hillary would get up and say, I have a 48-point plan to return manufacturing to America. And by the way, if you look at item 17 on page 42, footnote 4, and it came across as blah, 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 even though his policy, it was excellent. Donald had no policy. And one of the lessons in that is that advertising works. Most people don't have the time to study things. We had an ad that ran in America for some time by one of the big investment houses, where there's a guy standing in his kitchen with a knife with his shirt off, looking at his chest. And there's a doctor in the split screen saying, well, you make a 1.5-inch incision below your fourth rib. And then the narrator comes on and says, doing surgery on yourself doesn't make any sense. Neither does managing your own money. And that was, Adam Smith's great insight. Specialization makes for a much more profitable enterprises, lowers the prices of things. But most people don't, they don't specialize enough of their life in thinking about politics. That doesn't mean they're dumb. Walk into any blue-collar bar in America when some play is called by a referee that's controversial or an umpire, and you will see the most brilliant capability of analyzing things. Sometimes bartenders will pull out here's the basketball or Major League Baseball rule book, and they'll go through them. It isn't that people are dumb, it's that they don't see government and politics as being relevant to their lives in anything but the most superficial level. The Republicans figured that out long ago. They came up with nonsense like the death tax.
Yes.
They had persuaded millions of people that when you die, the government's going to come and take half of what you have. Even though at the time the exemption was like for a married couple with doing nothing, a married couple got $1.5 million.
So it's the branding of these things that is different. I mean, for me, the greatest branding exercise was rebranding anti-abortion as pro-life.
Yes,
it's genius.
Absolutely. And at the same time, not recognizing, 15 to 20% of pregnancies don't work out. They don't work out. And we've now seen a number of women die because they needed care and were denied it, including women who wanted to have more children. And I've said publicly a number of times, I was there. Because my first wife was near death in delivery with our sixth child. The doctors came to me and essentially, said, what are we going to do? Because she was all drugged up. She couldn't make any decisions. And I said, you choose the mother. I have 5 little children. Are you kidding? But, I can understand people who would say, well, it's God's plan and you have to choose the child. I don't, not what I did, but I appreciate that. But the underlying lesson is it's none of the government's damn business.
Yes. It's
a family matter. It's you and your spouse, the mother, if you're a man. It is just none of the government's business. Right. And it should be overwhelmingly the woman's decision. unless she's incapacitated.
But the contradiction
we
comes.
We don't have any appreciation of that about women. We have, women have always been subjugated by men, and that we've gotten as far as we have in terms of equality is actually kind of amazing. But nobody gives up power and the right to abuse others willingly.
Yes. And the anti-abortion movement is now looking at ways to control information about how and where to obtain abortions. And state lawmakers have filed at least 2 bills for the 2025 legislative session that target abortion-related speech. And that's my concern, that now, because free speech is one of those subjects that is been also weaponized, and Elon Musk is a great proponent of free speech who's shutting people down all the time because he doesn't like what they say about him. And that's a Laura Loomer reference from the last couple of days. But we're going to find that this access to information, access to expertise, all is diluted with this incoming regime.
So one of the things you're going to see this regime do is cut spending on Freedom of Information Act requests, which are already seriously underfunded. They're just going to say, we don't have the money for this, and they're going to slow walk requests. Most requests, by the way, under the Freedom of Information Act are not from journalists. They're from companies trying to learn about other companies and what they're up to.
Interesting.
It's been very clear that there will be an effort to criminalize leaving your state to get obstetrics health care in another state. And I don't know how this Supreme Court will rule on this. It raises very, very serious questions, but I can see this Supreme Court majority saying, well, you young woman, you went across the border to the next state and you had an abortion, you're going to prison for something that wasn't a crime in the other state. The Mann Act comes to mind here, which made it a crime to take a woman across state lines for immoral purposes and was upheld by the Supreme Court. There's going to be an all-out assault on freedom. There's going to be lots of civil actions and criminal actions to intimidate, soak up resources, divert attention, and any little slip is going to be blown up. I've said for many years, you can write lies about the police all day long that make them look good and they will never complain. But if you write a story about misconduct by the police and there is a comma subject to dispute, because that literally happened to me, a comma,
right,
they will try and end your career. And we're going to see a lot of that because, Donald says you shouldn't be allowed to write things or say things about me unless I approve of them. And I don't know what's more dictatorial than that.
Well, it's straight out of the Russian president's playbook or any of these. Maybe Viktor Orban, who's taken ownership of the Hungarian press effectively, right, and is now in a bromance with Donald Trump. Let's talk for a second about William Webster, the only man to head both the FBI and the CIA. He's now urged the U.S. Senate to reject Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard, Trump's nominees as director of the Bureau of National Intelligence, saying that they're unqualified. What is going to be the effect of, and Pete Hegseth, I should probably say, is another one who he wants to lead the U.S. military. What is the effect on the country, on Americans, America on the world stage, when you have zero expertise in these high positions? What does it do to the kind of fabric of America from a safety and security but also cultural perspective?
So Donald Trump always used to say, I only get the very best people, all the best people. It was not true then. It never has been true. But now he's not even claiming that. He is literally getting the worst people imaginable.
And Matt Gaetz is a good example of this. It was his first choice for AG.
Example. I'm going to take a child sexual predator and drug user and make him the Attorney General of the United States.
Yeah.
Pete Hegseth, a guy who he was in the Army. So what? I mean, my father was in the Army. He's not wasn't qualified to be defense secretary either. We have lots of talented, competent people around. John Bolton, whom I've interviewed, and I don't see the world the way he does at all, but I respect that he is a serious person you should listen to. So Donald is putting people in like Kash Patel, Pete Hegseth, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because his goal is to make the government totally bow to him. And the way he's working the Senate is that if you're a Republican senator, like Joni Ernst from Iowa, no great shakes as a U.S. senator, but she just couldn't stomach Hegseth because of what I think is pretty clearly evidence of him sexually assaulting this woman in Monterey. And guys who do that, they're not one-offs. You don't do that once and it's over. She was told right up front, we're going to primary you in the next election and you're going to be gone. Now, here's the bad part. More than 1 million people have died for this country. My father became a 100% disabled veteran because of World War II. And a politician who says, well, I'm going to have to bow to Donald because I might lose my office, you're a coward. You have no business holding any public office anywhere. We should humiliate you at every opportunity that you even think that way. But Donald knows how to bring pressure on people. Trust me, he's threatened to sue me so many times I can't begin to keep track of. Never has, because he knows he won't get anywhere. But Donald knows where the pressure points are on people. He finds out, who's vulnerable. When he's in front of a judge, he finds out things about, and we saw this quite openly in his recent trials.
Yes.
And so
with jurors especially.
Yes, jurors with children, grown children, whatever.
Yeah.
Donald pays money to people who will get him information like that.
Yeah.
And so the goal here is exactly what Steve Bannon said it was 8 years ago. We're going to deconstruct the administrative state. That's just highfalutin language for we're going to burn the place down. And Donald wants to just eliminate all of these things that he doesn't have absolute control over, he doesn't understand. So if he pursues this, we're going to have people get sick from food poisoning, and we're not going to know which factory canned those beans or processed that hamburger. So we can't stop other people from dying, which is what we can do now. We're going, the pro measles, mumps, polio lobby is going to be having a great time. He's going to try and eliminate lots of statistics. What do we need statistics for? Well, Donald, people who run serious businesses need those statistics to plan, to decide where to invest. Now, he's going to run into some conflict if he starts rounding up all the farm workers who don't just harvest crops in the fall. A lot of people come across the border for that, but they have to be tended all year round. There are little towns that'll just die. It will ruin the modest fortunes of the burgers in those towns, burger with an H, and it will make food prices go up. But none of this is stuff Donald doesn't, every time I read an article that says Trump and policy in the same paragraph, I'm like, these don't go together. There is no policy with Donald. He doesn't know what policy is.
But everything's transactional, and I suppose that's what we're learning, isn't it? We've seen this week when he escalated his threats to retake control of the Panama Canal, falsely accusing Panama of allowing Chinese soldiers to control the shipping route and the overcharging of American ships. I mean, it's all garbage. And yet, and I'm of the opinion that he saw a documentary on the Panama Canal that he, 3 o'clock in the morning on one of these channels while he was surfing and thought, aha, here's an opportunity. I mean, well,
and by the way, he misses 2 facts in this. Yeah. One of them is we stole Panama from Colombia because that isthmus was part of Colombia. And secondly, in a U.S. Supreme Court case where my father-in-law was the lawyer arguing for the losing side, Jesse Helms and Company, the removal of U.S. involvement in the canal was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. So it is, Donald, we were going to acquire Greenland, we're going to do this. A lot of that's to just distract you from the substantial things that he's doing. It is to provide his followers, the ignoranti among his followers, with something to keep stirring up the trouble about, to own the libs, as you put it.
And to give the impression that he is in control and he knows what he's doing and he has authority.
Yes. Right. That is all part of this game of Donald's. Because remember, in his own mind, Donald really does believe that no one else is qualified to run the country. No one ever has been or will be, that he's special and he's unique. And all of this grows out of the sick, dysfunctional nature of his family. But Donald believes this. Donald is not, some corrupt Simon Legree rubbing his hands together. He believes this stuff. And whenever something goes wrong, he changes the story.
Yeah.
He's totally flexible about that because he has no principles of any kind.
Or opinions, really. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? Yeah, yeah.
Say it again?
He doesn't seem to have any real opinions either. He'll just jump on.
No, it's like the healthcare thing. He'll destroy Obamacare, but he was once in favor of universal no out-of-pocket healthcare because it was the cheapest and most effective way to provide healthcare.
Yeah.
So, we're going to be in for a tough couple of years. There are going to be a lot of people, particularly in the Justice Department and the FBI and the intelligence services, who are going to be forced with this decision. Well, am I going to bend under to Donald, or am I going to tell my kids they have to withdraw from college because we can't pay their tuition?
Right.
We're going to see harassment of people through prosecution, through tax audits, as happened to the FBI Director Comey and his deputy. We're going to see civil actions brought in various ways. We're going to see a follow-through on his proposal. Originally, the Agriculture Department should be moved out of Washington and moved instead to Kansas City or somewhere like that in the Midwest.
So what you're describing is, it's a perfect description of authoritarianism, and I just do wish that the media would start to use that word a little more. And there's also a theory, and maybe you can shed some light just finally on whether there's any truth to it, that the posturing about Greenland and Panama, I mean, these things are all very useful to the Russian President Vladimir Putin. And if there was going to be a restructure, even Canada as a 51st state, who only knows? But this is all stuff that is on Vladimir Putin's shopping list, including removing the US from NATO.
Yes. So
is that going on?
Yes, absolutely. Donald, I've said for years, Donald is a wannabe dictator, and he's going to try and become our dictator and be the Emperor Donald, even though he wouldn't call himself that necessarily. Donald has never said a single critical word anywhere about Vladimir Putin. Now, Bill Barr did a huge disservice when he was Attorney General by asserting that the Mueller report had nothing in it. Well, first of all, what we didn't know at the time, and didn't know for about 2 years until Mueller testified to Congress, was Mueller didn't have the authority to do what we all thought he was doing, which was investigating what's going on with the Russians. He had a very, very limited scope of authority, and he's a Boy Scout, just like Merrick Garland. So instead of resigning or making big noise about it, he just said, okay, fine, that's what you want me to do. I'll do that. Donald, remember, weeks into his presidency in May of 2017, had an unannounced meeting in the Oval Office with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Sergei Kislyak, the ambassador, trained spy masters, and somebody from, quote unquote, the news agency TASS, who brought his gadget bag into the Oval Office, and God only knows what was in that bag in terms of electronic communications data. And we only know about this meeting because the Russians released the photographs of them smiling and talking. And what happened right after that? Well, we found out that Donald had given sources and methods to the Russians. Sources and methods. That's who told us this and how did we find that out? Shortly after that, Russian state television ran film of a group of men in a big meeting room, a typical government bureaucratic meeting. And guys come in, they throw a bag over the guy at the head of the table. He's never, ever seen again. And stories began appearing by intelligence reporters who have long, credible track records that Donald had given this guy up. And I can see Donald saying, well, I even have a guy right in your Kremlin who's telling us everything that's going on.
Yeah.
Shortly after that, articles appeared in the British, Dutch, Australian, and other countries' newspapers by credible intelligence reporters that these places were going to hold back on the information they would give the United States. When Donald opened up Trump Tower, which is, in my view, his only really great accomplishment in life was Trump Tower, He sold apartments at incredible premiums, more than anybody else got, even though they were crappy apartments with little galley kitchens and linoleum floors. Just typical Donald, says it's great and it's really cheap garbage. Because if you went to Donald and say, I want to buy apartment 28F, and he'd say $3 million, and you'd say, okay, so how do you want the title made out? Snow Inc. Donald would never say, oh, Snow Inc. Now, is that a ski lodge in Colorado or is that a cocaine business?
Yeah.
And so that building was full of, to this day, criminals, international criminals, Interpol, the New York, the NYPD's Organized Crime Bureau, the FBI. They're always watching that building and who's in it. An entire floor, the one immediately below Donald's apartment, was run as a casino by Russian mobsters. And Donald, when the FBI broke the place down, said, I had no idea. You can't get into the high floors of that building without going through security. There's no way he didn't know. Of course he knew. And so Donald just believes anything he does is right. And we're going to see this begin to play out. He will get blocked in a few places. But if the Senate bows down to him, if they voluntarily comply, we're going to get horrible people.
Yes.
He will further endanger our national security. And he may not abandon Ukraine. Despite all the things he said, if he concludes that he's better off forcing Putin to back off, he'll do that. It depends, because he's totally transactional. But your life will be much more in risk if you're in Europe or the United States on January 20th than it is today.
Okay, we have to finish, but it's chilling and certainly a reality check for people. David Cay Johnston, thank you for joining the Weekend Show.
Anthony, thank you very much.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News. You can see more from me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel and podcast, and I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.